This is a subject that people are afraid to talk about. I mean, it really is one of the top 2 subjects outside of finances and marriage that cause the most reasons for problems, communication, divorce, is sex. And tonight we're going to talk to you about that subject because we feel it's very, very important. We all enter marriage with preconceived ideas about sex. You get them from what you've heard, what you've seen, what you've read, or what you've experienced. So we're asking that before you begin your journey into marriage, and those of you who are already married, that we want you to see the beauty of sex the way God designed it. Not the way the world portrays it, but the way that God designed it.
But just starting out tonight, a little bit about our background. Theresa is my first and only wife. I mean, I haven't been married before. We have 3 children. 2 of those are Theresas from a previous marriage, and then we have 1 child together. So it was kind of we got married at the beginning of my senior year in college, and one of those things that's not well known, but we actually lived together for a year before we did get married, and I was fat, dumb, and happy. I could have just kept right on going. I didn't need to get. At least I didn't think that I needed to get married. I thought everything was fine, and to coin that phrase, I had my cake and could eat it too, and I didn't feel a need for any commitment, which was kind of interesting because coming from my background, my mom had been married. Well, she's on her 4th husband, which they've been married for quite some time. But I was the oldest of 11 children, and a lot of those were half brothers and sisters and step brothers and sisters. So just marriage itself wasn't well modeled for me. So for me, I didn't want to really even take that risk in getting married. So. But at one point in time, Theresa's like, no, this isn't cutting it for me. So we either have to move forward or we're going to have to find something else to do. So when that came about, we did end up getting married like 3 months after that, and this August we will have been married for 20 years. So it's been a wild time. It's been a great time, but there's always something new.
Yep. As Les said, I was previously married. I was married for 4 years, and our 2 oldest are from my first marriage. When I married Les, our daughter was 3, and my son Derek was 18 months old. So basically, Les is their dad. They have had contact with their dad, but in an environment where I had the kids, they were raised with him as their dad. I grew up in a home where my parents' views on sex were as different as night and day. There really was no balance. My mom was very prudish, very embarrassed about it, and my dad was totally the opposite. Very overbearing, pushy about it. It was just an uncomfortable environment because there was no meeting ground. And so for me, basically my sex education, my parents did have sex education with us, but mine came a lot from my religious background. And we'll get into that a little bit later in our talk.
So like I said, this is one of the most difficult subjects there is to talk about in premarital or even in a marriage is sex. And we find it's really interesting that we can joke about it. I mean, I don't know how many emails I get or who finds my email address or where things get forwarded to, but still even the number one websites that are visited on the internet today are still pornography websites. I mean, if you took all of that off of the net, the overall usage would be a very small amount if that was gone. But that's really not what God had created for us at all, is to deal with sex or talk about sex in that particular context. Marital sex is the most important, and it really is the only appropriate kind. But it gets ignored, and couples really do pay a terrible price if they really don't focus on what God had intended for sex. And you've heard it said that it's wise to learn from experience, so that's one of the things we're talking about tonight, is just some of the experiences that we've had. And I know that when we get in the breakout sessions, some of the other group leaders will share about some of the things that they've experienced both on the women's side and the men's side. I didn't prepare you for that tonight, Steve, so just be ready, okay? But and also, they also say that experience is one of the best teachers, but if there are things that you can, knowledge that you can take away that you don't have to learn, the hard knocks, that's often the best way to go. We are not the Dr. Ruth and the Dr. Phil of sex, so
No.
we're not going to be able to answer all your questions at all. So, and you won't get the Dr. Phil approach tonight either. So, but God's view on sex, we have to understand that God loves us enough to have created a really precious and wonderful gift as sex, and just from the simple matter that God created it, just makes it wonderful. That's one of the things that we need, and we need to celebrate that creation. And God's very pleased when we desire the one we love within the confines of marriage. And that's one of the things we'll really talk about tonight, is it was really intended to be within the confines of marriage. Since he designed sex, it makes sense that we'd be delighted, or that he would be delighted when we practice it according to his will. And sex, as God created it, results in just a wonderful satisfaction for both the husband and the wife. But we also have to keep in mind that if we violate that principle of marital sex, it takes away from the fulfillment that God really has planned and intended for us. In Genesis 2:24, and I've got several scripture references here, so you don't need to worry about that. We'll get you some notes on that. In Genesis 2:24, and Matthew 19:5, Mark 10:8, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians 5:31, it talks about where God's design was for us to become one flesh, and in those scriptures you'll find the two will become one. And God formed us really for that particular purpose within the confines of marital sex. And what truly sustains the beauty of sex? And there's really one thing that does, and that's valuing it. Giving sex the time and attention that it needs. It's just not something that you just jump into. I mean, it's one of those things that really does need to take the time, taking the time to learn about one another. And it's really about giving yourself entirely to your spouse. It's serving one another. It's ministering life. It's encouragement, and that's why a woman or a man does not want to just jump in from one bed to another. You really want to save yourself for your spouse and for that marriage. It's not just about the climax. It's the oneness that goes beyond the physical aspect of it. Truly getting to that higher plateau. And the best illustration in the Bible comes from Song of Solomon. It's one book out of 66 books in the Bible, and it's devoted to one thing, and that's the beauty of an undefiled marriage bed. And that's one of the things we really need to keep in mind. Hebrews 13:4 says that marriage must be respected by all, and the marriage bed kept undefiled, because God will judge immoral people and adulterers. What we see in the Song of Solomon, it truly is sacred love. Love that frees one from performance, from keeping up with the bodies of others, the passions of others, and the desires of others. And it's really made for you and your spouse. The more we understand about sex and about our spouse, the more patient we become. And 1 Corinthians 13:4 tells us that love is patient. That means that we need to put a lot of time into learning about our spouse and learning what pleases them and what doesn't please them. And the next time you think that your patience has reached its limits, just remember how patient and understanding Christ has been for us. Ephesians 4:2 tells us, be patient with one another, making allowances for each other's faults because of your love. And this is where we're secure in one another's love and commitment, regardless of what happens or does not happen on any particular night. Being patient, however, demands a cost, and we have to set aside time on our agenda. We have to yield our rights to welcome each other with open arms. Proverbs 19:11 reminds us, "A man's wisdom gives him patience. It is his glory to overlook an offense." And one of the most practical steps towards real patience is just truly learning to listen to your spouse. What makes the Song of Solomon such a classic? Because it doesn't read like a dirty novel at all. But it's just filled with just wonderful illustrations. But it's about a man and a woman who greatly appreciate one another's physical attributes. And it's about the love and the pleasure that God intended that relationship to have. It's not something that you talk about in the locker room after playing a round of racquetball or lifting weights, but it really is, purity and sacredness. And the comparison is never made about the past lovers or the ideal woman. I mean, Solomon's total focus is his bride. And he treasures the Shulamite woman beyond all belief when you really read the words that are in the Song of Solomon. And it's not, but not only that, in the words you can tell that it's an enjoyable and a fulfilling relationship. Truly what God's intention for us is.
I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of sex in your marriage. Actually, it should become one of the most important parts of your life, whether you want it to be or not, because it's going to affect every facet of your life. If you do not treat it that way, then you are shortchanging your spouse. Sex as God intended it is to be enjoyed to its utmost by being totally transparent and open with your spouse. And that sounds really easy to say, but it's not. When it comes to sex, it's not. It's something you have to work at. And you have to be willing to practice it. You have to spend time thinking of ways to keep sex fresh and fun. You need to study your spouse and discover what fulfills them sexually. Guess what, guys and ladies? Sex is not about you. It's about your spouse. And that's not what the world teaches us. We really are, if we're doing it the way God wants us to do it, we are about finding what pleases our spouse and doing what they want to do for us to fulfill our needs. That's when we honor and we're honest. Proverbs talks to us about honesty. Honesty deepens our relationship and makes us transparent with each other. Every husband and wife should take the responsibility of acquiring the necessary information to ensure that you're satisfying each other sexually. Fulfilling sex is one of the most powerful glues that you can have in your relationship. A sexually fulfilled man is a better father and a better employee. A sexually fulfilled woman has less stress in her life and more joy in her life. So that tells you how sex is vitally important to a healthy marriage. When we accept that God is pleased with when a married couple sexually satisfies each other, it removes any doubt for us to express ourselves because we know it's okay. He created it. Children are able to sense the security that flows between their parents when they witness and communicate that you respect one another and that you have a sexually fulfilled relationship. This is an example that we can set for our children someday when they have a spouse. And it was something we were always open with our children about. In fact, it's really funny now because Dan Cox, our pastor, walked into the copy room while I was making copies of that stuff for you guys, and Joni, his secretary, and I were over in the corner talking about it, and we didn't even know he was standing there. And so she's asking me some of the things that I'm going to talk about with you women afterwards, and he kind of clears his voice, and we're like, "Oh, Dan, we didn't know you were there." And he's like, "I heard a lot." And I'm like, "Oh, and how was that?" And he said, "Oh, I think I'm going to be embarrassed." I said, "How can you be embarrassed?" I said, "As a pastor, you know that this is the most great and awesome thing that God created." And he goes, "Yeah, you're right." And, it's just one of those things that if you teach your kids that, that's exactly what they're going to think about it. And, our youngest daughter, so we finished the conversation with Dan, and I said, "Yeah, the joke at our house with our daughter is, Mom and Dad, go get a room." And it's like, "No, you get a room, you move out. We want the whole house, not just one room.
She's graduating here in a couple weeks, so
so that's always the funny joke at our house. You know, she's like, oh my gosh. So,
guys, one of the things that it's also really pretty important. One of the big things when it comes to sex has to do with affection. And every time a couple gives or receives affection, they truly wrap a layer of protection around their marriage, and it's really something that's very critical. And it's affection, I think, is really easy for women, but it becomes a little more difficult for guys. I mean, it took me a long time to realize after we were married just what it meant to be affectionate. It just wasn't something that had been modeled very well for me. But some of the ways to establish affection in your marriage, you need to be able to show affection often, and make sure that you realize that you don't confuse affection with sex, because they're two different things. And that's even our daughters, like, even if I'm giving Theresa a hug or a kiss, and she's just like, oh guys, come on, you know. Talk about what pleases your spouse, but one of the things you never want to do is never withhold affection to punish your spouse. And we'll talk about it later on as well, but you never want to withhold sex to punish your spouse as well. You want to be able to plan some spontaneity into your marriage, and do not wait for your spouse to show affection first. I mean, initiate it, guys. I mean, I know it's tough, but build a bridge and get over it. Be patient with an unaffectionate spouse. If you're and you know, God only knows, Theresa was very patient with me.
Well, and that's my love language, physical touch. So for me, it's even more profound, because that's my, you know, how I want to be treated. And I mean, I want to hold hands, I want to hug. It doesn't matter where. It's just how I am.
And surprisingly enough, that's one of my love languages today as well. But if I'd taken that assessment 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been one of my love languages at all. Don't keep score in your marriage, especially when it comes to the affection. I mean, that's the big thing. And being a CPA, I mean, it would be real easy for me to just fill books on, you know, okay, you were a little short here, you know, you're a little long here, but it didn't compensate for what happened over here. Try new things to please your spouse, but if your spouse fails, don't be critical about them as well.
One of the things I want to talk to you about is communication. Communication and sexual satisfaction go hand in hand. You can't find out what satisfies you in sex if you don't tell your spouse. According to research, effective communication precedes and predicts later relationship problems that you're going to have. Without the skill of communication, your relationship is going to be hampered significantly. Here's some issues that I kind of want to go over with you guys that may be difficult to talk about, but they're critical if you want to reach God's design for healthy sexual intimacy. The first one's masturbation. It's a question that comes up often. People don't like to talk about it, but in God's eyes, that is not something that is appropriate in marriage. It's self-satisfying. That's what that is. And so what happens when people start masturbating, especially if they're young, it leads them into fantasies and eventually, statistically, into pornography. And so if you choose to do that in your marriage, you're opening the door for Satan, and you're opening the door that, you know, you'll be having sex with your spouse and you could be having a fantasy off somewhere else. So that is something that God does not look lightly upon. Abortion. I sit here today telling you I am a person who has had an abortion. But I know a God who forgives and heals. And yes, it's a grievous sin. It's something that I regret that I ever did. And I know my child awaits me when I get to heaven. But if you don't talk about it in your marriage, before you get married, it will become an issue. It became an issue for Les and I. When I got pregnant with Kayla, I was so fearful that God was going to do something awful to my baby. I deserved to be punished. that's not what God's like. And I went back into counseling and, was reaffirmed of the power of forgiveness and the power of God's grace and his mercy to set us free from all that. And we had a healthy, wonderful little girl. But if you don't deal with it, it will come back to haunt you. Sexually transmitted diseases. We know we live in an age of venereal diseases, AIDS, all of those kind of things. We can't just turn our back on them and act like they're not there. Those of us who have had sex before marriage know that that is a risk that we take. If you have one of those diseases, you can't hide that from your future spouse. You have to deal with it because other issues come into play if you don't. Illnesses and sicknesses. Whether you come into a marriage with some kind of illness or sickness, or whether you develop something after you're married, is so important to talk about. A big issue for women is endometriosis. It's something that I know of 2 married couples that had no idea the women had this before they got married, and they are dealing with it now that they're married, and it's very difficult. But they're willing to research and find out all the information, and their husbands are very supportive of them. Another example of illnesses is, you could end up with MS, muscular dystrophy. I mean, there's things that in our life as we go through, we have no idea what's going to happen. And you have to be willing to realize that sex is connected to those. Doesn't mean that it's everything. And that if you can't have sex at some time in your relationship when you're married, that it's the end of the world. But if you haven't communicated and had a good relationship sexually before that, it's going to make it even more difficult. Cancer. I know one of my biggest fears as a woman is breast cancer. What would I do if I lost my breasts? They're important to me, and in my interpretation, they're important to my husband. But that's not what defines me to him. He doesn't just look at my body, he looks at my heart. My heart is what makes him attracted to me. Prostate cancer for men. I mean, those are things, other cancers that you go through. My boss is a cancer survivor, and she'll tell you that for a long period of time, it's something they had to deal with in their relationship. It wasn't a priority. Life and death were. Paralyzation. When you look at Christopher Reeves, when I have spent a lot of time around people who are paralyzed in wheelchairs, either paraplegics or quadriplegics, when I worked at the VA, and we did activities, winter and summer, like Olympics and stuff. It's an issue. If it happens to you, you're going to have to find a way to deal with it and talk about it and work your way through that. So just keep in mind, there's just a whole gamut of things that you have to think about to be honest and open about that you may have gone through or are going through. And there is so much material available to help you work through it. That, sometimes, I know for me that sometimes if I feel so strongly that I just am scared and can't communicate it, then I write it. I will write it to Les. Because then I can give it to him and he can read it, feel like a big load's been lifted off my shoulder, and then we can talk about it. But just don't stuff it. You have to find a way to talk about all these kind of issues.
One of the other big things, and it can be a huge stumbling block when it comes to, after your marriage, but it's actually something you need to deal with before you're married, and that's our past mistakes. It's normal and it's natural for an engaged couple to really feel, a strong driving passion for one another. That's the way God created us. He created us with a sexual drive and desire, but He created it with that says, okay, we need to wait, and we need to save this for the marriage bed. But a sweet blessing comes to those who really maintain that purity without entanglements and bondages that come along with that. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that if you have had, and Theresa would be the first one to tell you, I had been very sexually active before we were married. And I didn't think anything about it. It was, like I said, it was something that hadn't been modeled well for me. But your future spouse really needs to know whether or not he or she is marrying a virgin. It may affect whether or not he or she decides to marry